In the spring of 1913, a crowd gathered in the San Fernando Valley to watch water arrive. Not a river, not rain. A man-made channel, 233 miles long, carved through desert and mountain from a place most of them had never been. When the first water reached the end, William Mulholland stepped forward and said 5 words. "There it is. Take it." The crowd went wild. Los Angeles had its water. What nobody said out loud, what the newspapers did not print, what the official histories would take decades to acknowledge, was where that water came from, and what happened to the place it left behind. This is the story of William Mulholland, not the great engineer, the man who drained a valley, broke 1,000 families, built a dam that collapsed in the night, and killed over 400 people who never knew they were in danger. He did not steal gold. He did not steal land. He stole water. In California, there has never been anything worse to steal. William Mulholland arrived in Los Angeles in 1877 with nothing. No formal education, no engineering degree. He was 22 years old, Irish-born, and had spent his youth at sea and then in the ground, working ships in the Atlantic, then digging ditches and cleaning wells in Michigan and Ohio before making his way west. He arrived in a city of 11,000 people. He got a job with the Los Angeles City Water Company, turning valves and reading pressure gauges. Within a decade, he had taught himself hydraulic engineering from textbooks, borrowed from the city's small public library, and read at night, and was running the entire operation. This detail matters because it explains a great deal about how Mulholland made decisions. He was not an engineer trained to consult, to document, to review, to defer to others. He was a self-made technician whose confidence came from personal mastery. He knew the Los Angeles water system the way a man knows a house he built himself, intimately, intuitively, without needing plans, because he was the plans. That capacity had served him brilliantly for 30 years. It would destroy him in the end. By 1902, when the city bought the private water company and formed the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply, Mulholland became its superintendent. He was not a bureaucrat. He was not a politician. He was the kind of man who walked every pipe, every ditch, every valve himself, and who could tell you the flow rate of any channel in the system from memory. His employees were afraid of him. His bosses trusted him completely. For a generation, he was the most important person in Los Angeles, more powerful than any mayor, because he controlled the one thing the city could not survive without. The problem was that Los Angeles was running out of it. By 1904, the city's population had doubled in a decade and was doubling again. The Los Angeles River, which had supplied the city since the Spanish missions, was no longer enough. Mulholland did the math himself, repeatedly, and each time arrived at the same number. The city had perhaps 5 years before demand outpaced supply permanently. He needed a new source. He needed something large enough to serve not just the city as it was, but the city he believed it would become. He found it in the Owens Valley, 230 miles to the north. The Owens Valley runs between 2 mountain ranges, the Sierra Nevada to the west and the White Mountains to the east. It sits at roughly 4,000 feet elevation in what is technically the Great Basin, a vast inland drainage system where rivers run not to the sea but to terminal lakes which evaporate. The Owens River, fed by Sierra snowmelt, ran the length of the valley from north to south and emptied into Owens Lake at its southern end. In 1904, the valley was agricultural land. Farmers had been there since the 1860s, irrigating alfalfa, grain, and fruit orchards from the river. The lake was 20 miles long and 12 miles wide. Steamboats had operated on it. A soda extraction industry worked the shoreline. The valley had approximately 2,000 permanent residents, small towns with newspapers, churches, schools, a functioning rural community in the high desert. The people there had come in the period after the Civil War. Many were families who had moved west, seeking exactly what the valley offered: cheap land, clear water, a growing season long enough to support real farming. They had built irrigation systems at their own expense. They had negotiated water rights under California law. They had invested a generation of labor into the land. It also had more water annually than its population could use. That was the fact Mulholland needed. Everything that followed came from that single measurement. What followed next is the part that takes some time to explain, because the official version and the actual version are two different stories. The official version: Los Angeles needed water, identified the Owens Valley as a surplus source, negotiated water rights, and built an aqueduct that served the common good. The actual version begins with a man named Fred Eaton. Eaton was the former mayor of Los Angeles and Mulholland's close friend. In the summer of 1904, Eaton traveled to the Owens Valley alone, representing himself not as a Los Angeles official, but as a private rancher looking to purchase land. He bought options on key land parcels and, more importantly, began quietly purchasing water rights along the Owens River. He told the farmers what he needed. He did not tell them why. Simultaneously, a federal reclamation project was underway in the Owens Valley. The U.S. Reclamation Service had been surveying the valley for years with the intention of building a federal irrigation system that would have permanently secured the valley's agricultural future. The farmers knew about it. They had been cooperating with federal surveyors. They believed their water rights were about to be formalized and protected. In June 1905, the Reclamation Service abruptly withdrew from the Owens Valley project. The reason given was vague. What had actually happened was that Joseph Lippincott, the lead Reclamation Service engineer for Southern California, had also been working, simultaneously and secretly, as a paid consultant to the city of Los Angeles. He had provided Mulholland with detailed survey data from the federal project, including information about water volumes, land ownership, and the technical feasibility of a southbound aqueduct. He had also helped ensure the federal project was cancelled at the right moment. The city of Los Angeles then began purchasing the water rights Eaton had optioned. By the time the Owens Valley farmers understood what was happening, most of their water already belonged to someone else. On July 29, 1905, the Los Angeles Times ran the story under a headline that read, "Titanic Project to Give City a River." The article described it as a triumph of civic engineering. There was no mention of Lippincott. There was no mention of how the water rights had been acquired. There was no mention of what would happen to the Owens Valley when the river left. The Los Angeles voters approved bonds for the aqueduct by a margin of 14-1. Most of them had no idea where the water was coming from. Construction began in 1908. Mulholland supervised every mile of it personally, riding inspection by horse and then by automobile as roads were built section by section. The workforce at peak construction numbered 5,000 men. They were building in desert temperatures that reached over 100 degrees, cutting through volcanic rock in the Mojave, hauling steel pipe across terrain where no roads existed, establishing supply camps in empty wilderness. The conditions were brutal. Workers lived in canvas tents. Water for drinking had to be hauled in by mule team to the forward camps while they were building the system to bring water in permanently. Men were paid $2 a day. The tunnels were dug by hand with dynamite and picks. The Elizabeth Tunnel alone required 4 years to complete, bored through 5 miles of rock from both ends simultaneously, the two crews meeting in the middle within inches of alignment. That precision, in an era before electronic surveying, was a genuine technical achievement. There were also the deaths. The official count was 43. The actual number was higher. Deaths of undocumented workers, of day laborers who were hired informally and had no family filing claims, went unrecorded or were recorded as accidents without follow-up. The workers who died were buried where they fell, in some cases their graves marked with wooden stakes that did not survive the desert. Their names are not on the plaque at the aqueduct's opening point. What Mulholland built, nonetheless, was genuinely impressive by the engineering standards of any era. 233 miles of open canal, tunnel, siphon and pipe, dropping in elevation from 4,000 feet at the intake to 800 feet at the outflow, engineered to move water entirely by gravity. No pumps, no electricity, no moving parts along most of its length. It was completed in 5 years at a cost of $24.5 million, under budget and ahead of schedule. Engineering journals called it one of the greatest public works projects in American history. They were not wrong about the engineering. Construction was complete by 1913. The aqueduct opened in November. Quote _2 _. What was left behind was beginning to die. The Owens River, which had fed the valley for centuries, was now being redirected south at the intake. The farmers who still held small downstream water rights found that without the main river flow, their irrigation systems had nothing to draw from. Crops failed in the first dry season. Farms that had been producing for 30 years went dry within 2. Families who had built everything they owned on the assumption that their water rights were permanent, rights they held legally, rights that had been acknowledged and recorded, discovered that the city had purchased the upstream rights that made theirs meaningless. A water right to a river that no longer flows to you is not a water right. It is a document. Between 1905 and 1920, Los Angeles systematically bought out most of the remaining private landholdings in the valley. Some farmers sold willingly, exhausted by the losses, and offered what seemed like fair market value. Though what constitutes fair market value for land that has just been stripped of its water is a philosophical question the city did not linger over. Others refused and watched their farms fail anyway. The city's method was straightforward and required no legal coercion. Purchase upstream water rights, wait for the downstream farms to become unproductive, then offer to purchase the failed farm at a fraction of its prior value. It worked nearly every time. By 1920, Los Angeles owned roughly 80% of the farmland in the Owens Valley and controlled the water rights to most of what remained. The towns still existed, the people still lived there, but the economy that had sustained them for 50 years was functionally gone. The valley did not accept this quietly. On May 21, 1924, a group of ranchers drove to the Alabama Gates section of the aqueduct, a concrete control structure about 40 miles north of the main intake, and simply opened the gates. For 4 days, they let the water run freely into the desert wash, diverted away from the aqueduct and back toward the dry lake bed. They brought food and musical instruments and camped there in the open. Reporters came from Los Angeles and San Francisco. The story ran on front pages. Mulholland drove up himself and stood across from the men he had spent 20 years draining and met with them. He promised a reparations committee. He promised the city would establish a fund to compensate those who had suffered losses. He was persuasive. The gates were closed. The reparations fund was never established. 11 months later, the first dynamite went off. An aqueduct section near Lone Pine was destroyed on May 27, 1927. Over the following 2 years, there were at least 10 bombings. The no-name siphon, Tuttle Creek, the Alabama Gates again, sections of concrete pipe and canal that Mulholland's workers had built by hand were being methodically destroyed by people who had run out of other options. Los Angeles sent armed guards, private detectives, investigators from the Pinkerton Agency. Nobody was ever charged. The valley was small and everyone knew everyone. Witnesses had short memories when questioned. The bombings damaged the aqueduct but could not stop it. The flow continued south. Los Angeles kept growing. Mulholland did not appear particularly troubled by the conflict. He made public statements characterizing the valley farmers as agitators and outside provocateurs. He described the bombings as criminal sabotage against public infrastructure, which they were, without acknowledging the mechanism by which the public had come to own the infrastructure in the first place. He was not dissembling. He appears, from the record, to have genuinely believed that what he had done for Los Angeles justified what had happened to the Owens Valley. The city needed water. The valley had it. The transfer was legal. The math was simple. That other people's lives had been built around that water, that a community had existed there for 2 generations, that the federal project had been deliberately undermined to make the acquisition possible, these do not seem to have registered as problems of the kind that required reckoning. He was not unusual in this. The era's understanding of property, of eminent domain, of what constituted a public good, was not the same as ours. But it is worth noting that the people in the Owens Valley had a different understanding, one that seemed obvious to them from the day their crops began to fail, and that nobody in Los Angeles felt the need to reconcile the two. By 1927, the Owens Valley was functionally finished as an agricultural region. The river was a fraction of its original flow. Owens Lake was shrinking. Within a generation, it would be gone entirely. 110 square miles of dry alkali flat, the largest single source of particulate dust pollution in North America. A problem so severe, it would eventually require Los Angeles to spend hundreds of millions of dollars suppressing dust from a lake the city had eliminated. The town of Keeler, which had operated as a port, would still exist, surrounded by white powder, with nothing to port and nowhere to go. Mulholland, by this point, was in his early 70s, famous, decorated, and building something new. The St. Francis Dam. The aqueduct system needed storage, a buffer reservoir that could supply Los Angeles through dry years, or keep the city alive during an emergency shutdown of the line, earthquake, structural failure, or sabotage, which by 1926 was no longer a hypothetical. Mulholland chose a site in San Francisco Canyon, roughly 40 miles northwest of Los Angeles. He had surveyed it himself. He liked the canyon walls. He designed the dam himself without commissioning independent review of his design. He oversaw construction himself. It was a curved concrete gravity dam, 185 feet high, 12 feet thick at the crest, widening to approximately 175 feet at the base. The reservoir behind it held 12 billion gallons of water. Filling it took 3 years. What Mulholland did not adequately investigate was what the canyon walls were made of. The eastern abutment rested against rock that was, at depth, ancient landslide debris, compressed remnant material from a prehistoric geological event, not solid bedrock. This formation was known to exist in the region. Geological surveys of the canyon had documented it. The surveys performed specifically for the dam project did not go deep enough to characterize it fully. Mulholland did not hire outside geologists to review the site selection. No outside geological review was required. His track record was 50 years of structural success. The western abutment presented a different problem. A band of mica schist running through the canyon wall. Mica schist is a layered metamorphic rock. It is stable when dry. When saturated under sustained water pressure, its layers separate along planes that become lubricated by the water moving through them. It was understood in geological literature by 1928 that mica schist was a poor foundation material for water-retaining structures. This information existed. It was not in Mulholland's library, or not prominently, or it was, and he trusted his direct inspection over the published concern. In the weeks before the failure, workers at the site noticed something. Seepage at the dam's base, water emerging downstream of the structure, was increasing. This is not, by itself, an emergency signal. All large concrete dams seep to some degree, particularly when first filling or after rain. What made the San Francisco seepage notable, though workers could not have named this precisely, was that the water on the western side had color. It was reddish-brown. Turbid water emerging from a dam base means the water is carrying material. It is not seeping through hairline cracks in cured concrete. It is moving through something that has particles in it. On March 7, 1928, Mulholland drove to the dam with his assistant, Harvey Van Norman. They walked the perimeter. They examined the seepage. Mulholland assessed the situation as within normal parameters. He recommended continued monitoring. He drove back to Los Angeles. 5 days later, March 12, 1928, a Monday. The Santa Clara River Valley below the dam was in its nighttime quiet. The Edison Company maintained power line work camps in the canyon, workers and their families housed in small structures along the streambed. Farms occupied the flatlands further downstream. The town of Fillmore, 20 miles below the dam, was asleep. Santa Paula, 35 miles down, was asleep. The Pacific Ocean was 54 miles south. At 11:47 in the evening, the St. Francis Dam failed. The sequence was rapid beyond any possibility of useful warning. The eastern abutment, the ancient landslide material, fully saturated after 3 years of reservoir pressure, began to move. The western flank gave way within seconds, the mica schist shearing along its waterlogged plains. The concrete structure, which had been designed to resist water pressure from the front, had no resistance to the canyon walls moving out from under it laterally. It separated into sections. The central monolith, a piece of concrete weighing thousands of tons, remained standing for a time as the water rushed past it on both sides. It was found the next morning more than half a mile downstream, intact, deposited in the flood debris like a discarded building block. 12 billion gallons of water was in San Francisco Canyon within seconds of failure. It moved as a wave estimated at over 100 feet high at its origin point, traveling south at approximately 18 miles per hour. The Edison Company work camps were the first to go. The workers and their families were asleep. The camps were in the canyon floor, in the path of the maximum flow. Survival depended entirely on whether you happened to be on high ground or in a structure on elevated terrain. Most were not. The flood continued south into the Santa Clara River Valley. It spread as it traveled, losing height but gaining width, covering the valley floor in moving debris, concrete rubble, uprooted trees, demolished structures, vehicles, livestock, and the dead. Farms that had been worked for 30 years were stripped to the soil or buried under 10 feet of silt. Orchards were gone. Roads were erased. A school that sat in the path was demolished to its foundation. The wave reached the Pacific Ocean approximately 6 hours after the dam failed. The final death toll was not established with certainty. The official inquest count was 431. Historians studying the event have consistently estimated the actual number was higher, perhaps significantly higher. Many of the dead were Mexican-American agricultural workers, migratory laborers without formal employment records or family in the region who would have reported them missing. Several bodies were recovered as far as 60 miles from the dam. An unknown number were carried to sea and never found. The specific count of 431 represents those whose deaths were formally documented. The rest remained in the number of people who were simply gone. The final death toll was never precisely established. The official inquest counted 431 bodies. The actual number was certainly higher. Many victims were migratory workers, day laborers without family connections or formal documentation, whose deaths went unrecorded. Some bodies were found 60 miles downstream. Some were never found. The valley downstream of the dam had been farmland for a generation. In 6 hours, it was gone. Fields, orchards, fences, swept away down to bare rock in some places, buried under 10 feet of debris in others. Hundreds of families lost everything they owned. Some survived by reaching high ground. Others were in the wrong place. The inquest began within days. The governor of California ordered an independent commission. Engineers from across the state were brought in to examine the debris, the geology, and the design records. William Mulholland attended the proceedings. He did not send a lawyer to answer on his behalf. He sat at the witness table himself and answered questions in a voice that the reporters in the room consistently described the same way: flat, direct, without visible emotion. He was 72 years old. He had built one of the great engineering projects of his century. He had just caused one of the worst civilian disasters in California history. When the inquiry asked him directly about responsibility for the dam's failure, he did not hedge. He did not invoke the geological complexity. He did not say the conditions were unforeseeable, though his lawyers would have preferred that answer. He said, "I envy the dead." 3 words that contained everything. The inquest chairman asked him to clarify. He did not clarify. He sat in silence. The commission concluded that the dam had failed due to geological conditions that had not been adequately investigated: the eastern abutment's ancient landslide composition, the mica schist on the western side. The design was found to be appropriate for the geological conditions as Mulholland had understood them. The geological understanding had been insufficient. The commission did not determine whether the insufficiency was negligence. No criminal charges were filed. Not against Mulholland, not against the Bureau, not against anyone. The city of Los Angeles paid out settlements to survivors and the families of victims. The amounts were not made public in full, and the legal proceedings stretched across years. What the families received, when measured against 431 deaths and hundreds of destroyed farms and livelihoods, was modest. Mulholland resigned from the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply on November 17, 1928, 8 months after the flood. He had been superintendent for 26 years. He left the office he had built from a private water company's meter reading department into one of the most powerful municipal agencies in America. He walked out and did not come back. He lived for 7 more years. He did not give interviews. He did not write a memoir. He did not appear at the anniversary commemorations that began to form around the St. Francis Dam failure in the years that followed. He spent those years at his home in Los Angeles, tended by his family, declining in health, surrounded by the city he had made possible. The city continued without him. The aqueduct continued to run. The water continued to arrive from the north. He died on July 22, 1935. He was 79 years old. His obituaries in the Los Angeles papers were extensive and largely respectful. They described the aqueduct in detail. They mentioned the St. Francis Dam. The ratio of space given to each was not equal. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power named a highway after him. Mulholland Drive runs along the Santa Monica Mountains, the ridge above the city, 21 miles of winding road with views of the basin below, the basin that had been desert in 1877 when he arrived, and that by his death held 1.5 million people fed by water from 233 miles away. The highway is still there. It appears in films, in songs, in tourist maps. It carries his name past the houses of actors and executives who live above the city he built, who have no particular reason to think about where their water comes from. The Owens Valley did not recover. Los Angeles continued to operate the aqueduct, extracting what water rights it held, and then, in 1970, built a second aqueduct alongside the first, doubling the extraction rate. The second aqueduct increased the valley's water losses to a point where the remaining farmers, who had held out through the first half of the century, were for practical purposes finished. The Bureau negotiated, purchased remaining rights, and extended its footprint. By the end of the 20th century, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power owned and controlled the majority of land and water in a valley the size of Connecticut. Owens Lake, which had been gone since the 1920s, became a public health issue. The dry lakebed, 110 square miles of fine alkaline dust, churned up by desert winds, produced particulate matter that exceeded federal air quality standards regularly, causing respiratory illness in valley residents and occasionally reaching visible dust storm conditions. The Great Basin Air Pollution Control District in 1998 designated the dry Owens Lakebed as the largest single source of particulate pollution in the United States. The responsible party, under air quality law, was Los Angeles, which had drained the lake. The city was required to mitigate. Mitigation has cost over $2 billion to date. Shallow flooding, gravel spreading, vegetation planting, measures designed to keep the dust on the ground. The city pays to suppress dust from a lake it created by removing the water. This arrangement is legally required and ongoing. In 2023, unusual winter precipitation partially refilled sections of the lakebed for the first time in decades. Photographs circulated of water in Owens Lake. There was discussion of restoration. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power studied the feasibility. The conclusion, summarized plainly, restoring Owens Lake to a functioning water body would require returning water that Los Angeles currently depends on for its supply. No restoration plan was adopted. There is a plaque in the Owens Valley, near the Alabama gates, where the ranchers camped for 4 days in 1924. It marks the site of the water protest. The Department of Water and Power built the plaque. The text describes the event as a regrettable episode in a complex history. It does not mention that the reparations fund Mulholland promised at those gates was never established. It does not name the farmers who stood there. It presents the incident as a historical curiosity, something that happened, something that passed, something the institution acknowledges without consequence. The aqueduct is still in operation. It has been running for 112 years. It carries water south every day. There is no plaque for the 431. The last photograph taken of William Mulholland at the aqueduct was from the opening ceremony in November 1913. He is standing on the spillway with a crowd around him just after he said his 5 words. He is 67 years old. His expression is not triumph, it is satisfaction. The quiet satisfaction of a man who solved an engineering problem. A man who needed water and found some and moved it. Whether he understood what that sentence meant for the people in the place the water came from is a question nobody asked him directly. Whether he cared is a question the record does not answer. What the record does answer, he knew the Owens Valley would lose its water supply. He designed a system to take it all. He built that system over 5 years of difficult labor with impressive precision and skill. He stood on the spillway on November 5, 1913, and watched the first water arrive, and said, "There it is, take it." And he was right. There it was. The valley behind him was already starting to die. Last video, we looked at prisons that promised salvation, institutions built on the idea that suffering could reform. Today, a man who built something undeniably real, undeniably functional, undeniably useful, and who never seemed to grasp that useful to Los Angeles and good were not the same sentence. Next video, a medication prescribed to millions of people. The manufacturer conducted clinical trials. The trials showed what the drug did to patients. The manufacturer knew the results before the drug was approved. The FDA received the data. The prescriptions continued for years. The number of people affected is not a rounding error. We will go through the documents. Every story in this series has the same architecture underneath it. Someone with power, someone without it, and a decision made when nobody was looking. Mulholland made his decisions in public, in daylight, with newspapers cheering. That is perhaps the most useful detail of all. The water is still flowing. The valley is still dust. The highway still carries his name along the ridge above the city he fed, on the way to nowhere in particular, overlooking everything he built and nothing of what it cost. There it is. Take it.